Hello and welcome to the CX Files podcast for January 13th, 2022. I'm Mark Hillary and I'm here in Sao Paulo, Brazil.
And I'm Peter Ryan here in Montreal, Quebec, Canada. Happy New Year and welcome to 2022. Mark, I can't believe I'm actually saying it's 2022. Time just seems to fly by. But I'm really excited about this episode where we're going to be talking to Lisa Stoner, who is the Global Head of Support Operations at Uber. And interestingly enough, for all of our listeners that are focused around the outsourcing and BPO space, Lisa's also on the board of Transcom.
Yeah, it's funny. So Uber has turned into a verb in a lot of ways. There's both, I want to Uber somewhere, like just the verb of getting around. But I can't tell you how many things I'm invited to that have the term Uberize.
Happy New Year, Peter, and to all the listeners. It's great to be back again. I know that everyone loves taking time off at the end of the year. I managed to get 3 entire weeks without doing any work. But it's always good to start again with a whole new year ahead of us. So how was your New Year celebration, Peter? Good to be back at work?
Mark, it's great to be back at work, and I'm always excited when the year starts out. I'm very optimistic. I'm a positive person by nature, glass half full, and I can't believe how we've hit the ground running at the start of this calendar year. The emails have been flying in, the activity in the CX space has been tremendous. But I also think it's important to let our listeners know that there's going to be a few changes to the CX files. And the format is going to be shifting to, I'd say, a bit more of a conversational tone on a weekly basis. And Mark, maybe talk a little bit about what prompted the idea that we were going to shake things up just a little bit when it comes to the weekly pod.
Well, CX Files has been running since 2018. We're just about to hit episode 300 in the near future. Every week since 2018, there's been a brand new interview from somebody in the industry. So, we've covered off loads of different companies and brands and the BPOs, the advisors, the technology companies. But we just felt that there's always a lot more that we want to say rather than just the interview. And so particularly since you came on board, Peter, and started contributing to the interviews as well, it just felt like, you've got both of us contributing the interviews each week, but without actually sort of putting in our own views and opinions. So, from now on, I think that it's going to be us opening the podcast before going to an interview. So there's still going to be an interview every week, but you're going to hear from both Peter and I about, the latest news, what we've observed on LinkedIn or elsewhere on the web as well, before we go into the interviews.
And I think also, Mark, there's another element to it. You and I collectively have been dealing with a lot of interactions from people on the back of these interviews. We're getting a tremendous amount of engagement in terms of who we're bringing on, some of the themes that we're talking about. And I know that we're going to spend some time each week moving forward talking about some of that feedback and taking potentially questions from some of our audience, talking a little bit about some of the comments that they provide to us. And really, I think trying to make this as interactive a podcast as possible with a very growing listenership from around the world.
Yeah, and that's one thing that we certainly are. And I know that people have commented on that before as well, how global this podcast is, because there has been guests on this podcast from every single continent across the world, except for Antarctica so far. And we're working on the British Geographic Survey down there to see if we can get them on board. But I think that making it more interactive is certainly one of the goals here. And, today we've got Lisa from Uber. Next week, we're going to be talking about consumer anger and have consumers become more angry over the past 2 years, especially during the pandemic. And so I think that, if you give questions and feedback, we will use this period at the beginning of the podcast each week to sort of go through the best comments and questions and discuss them.
I think your point's really well taken, that we have had people on the podcast from literally every continent, and we have a listenership that is just tremendous. And it doesn't matter if you're listening in Melbourne, it doesn't matter if you're listening in Paris, you might be in Jakarta, you might be in Portsmouth, it really doesn't matter. What counts is we want to get your feedback. So if you have a question, if you have a comment based on what you've heard, please get in touch with Mark or myself via LinkedIn. We would love to find out what you have to say, not just about about the podcast itself, but about our new format and the way it's going.
Okay, so let's kick off this first edition of the new format then. So why don't we start by having a look at the recent CX news? Has anything caught your eye recently, Peter?
Yeah, Mark, absolutely. Something did catch my eye earlier this week. Now, this isn't pertaining directly to CX, but what it does do, I think, has a real implication for the customer management industry. And it was an article I saw in the Financial Times that discussed the growing anti-work movement that's being fueled across the social network Reddit. Now, the implications I think for this are really profound. And while we were catching a glimpse of this anti-work Great Resignation movement in the latter part of 2021, there's still a lot to be worried about going into the coming year, especially in the customer management space. Now, the article indicated there seems to be a view among many in the workforce that traditional shift work is just not worth the bother anymore. And for me, what was really interesting in the article was the acknowledgement by one executive that individuals working in some of these jobs that might comprise shift work and potentially even customer management roles, they don't want to push paper. They actually want to have a contribution in terms of what they're making in their roles. They want to make sure that there's some meaning in regards to what their jobs are actually coming across. So, Mark, the question would be then, what's the implication for the customer management space with the anti-work movement going into 2022? Well, look, first of all, we know that attrition and disengagement has always been a problem in the contact center, whether captive or outsourced. And I think that this article really signals a clarion call for the sector like never before. And the reality is that unless the CX industry's leaders can find a manner in which new recruits have a sense of what they can accomplish long-term from a career perspective and why their role is important in a more holistic sense, the ongoing trend of the Great Resignation or the anti-work movement is just going to become more pronounced. You're going to see more people walking out of their roles or quitting via text message. I think it also heralds the potential for work from home and gig working like never before, but I think you'll agree those are topics for another podcast.
Yeah, definitely. I think that especially the gig working idea there, and the idea that people who want more flexibility could actually find that through gig work. So rather than it being a negative, perhaps it could be a positive in the CX space. I was looking around and over the Christmas holidays, and I think that one thing that struck me that was particularly interesting was Joe Biden, the president of the United States. He signed an executive order just before Christmas that actually orders government agencies to take customer service more seriously. And I think that, that's really interesting to see a national leader actually signing orders telling people to take CX seriously. He's actually looking at the number of American government departments that are still, even now, expect people to visit offices in person, bringing bundles of paper, when, so many of these services should be available online in 2022. What's interesting as well, I think, is the main driver. He said the main driver for this initiative is to restore trust in government. And I think that that's interesting because quite often the people who are forced to sort of go and stand in line are the people who need help from the government. And these are often the people that are least able to give up that time. So if you talk about, a young single mother trying to get help from the supplemental nutrition program in the States, well, you're asking her to go and give up a day at work to go and stand in some line to go and get some help. And really, that's not a CX question. It's just a fundamental question of helping citizens. So, I've seen this happen with several governments now. And what we've really seen is this kind of Amazon effect. People see in one area of their life how things should function, and then they demand it in other industries and areas. So it's no surprise that governments are feeling under pressure, and hopefully utilities feel the same kind of pressure as well.
Well, I think they have to. And at the end of the day, they're providing a service to the citizens. They're providing a service to taxpayers, and full marks to the US government for recognizing this, full marks to the executive for understanding the customer experience needs to be a focus in terms of how the citizenry interacts with its government and the responsibility the government has to provide a quality level of service. And I think that your point's very well taken about individuals who are more than likely to stand in line, spending hours, if not days, trying to get a problem solved. There needs to be a focus on making sure that resolution and swift resolution is going to be a priority, no matter what the government, no matter what the country.
Okay, and so what else have you seen online? Have you seen anything on LinkedIn recently, Peter?
Yeah, I did, Mark. And something that really struck me over the course of the last week was the announcement by a friend of mine and a friend to many from the CX Files podcast that Dino Forte is going to be resigning as the CEO of Ventrica. Now, for those who don't know Ventrica and Dino, it has been one of the most successful independent BPO operators based in the United Kingdom. Most recently, Dino is credited with having taken Ventrica into Jamaica. Now, I think this is important because, to my knowledge, it's the first UK pure play BPO that is set up in Jamaica with the purpose for servicing British consumers. And Dino has spent a good decade plus at the helm. He's done tremendous work. And as somebody who's gotten to know Dino over the course of the past year, I'm sure he's going to be going on to pastures new, pastures green. And on behalf of everybody here at the CX Files podcast, we wish him well.
Yeah, definitely. That's a great story. I mean, for me, there's a sort of positive and negative on LinkedIn at the moment. The first thing is the polls. I mean, what's happened with the polls recently? They've kind of exploded in the past couple of months. I mean, I know you've been doing for a year or so, you've been doing your Friday 80s poll, but that's genuine. It's fun. Everybody kind of enjoys giving feedback to that. But now you're seeing so many people asking really stupid, dumb questions, and it's almost like they're screaming out for interaction. I keep blocking all these people that are just asking things like, what time do you take your lunch break?
I saw one the other day asking what was the best age to get married. And I think that your response to that poll was absolutely classic. It was something to the extent of, could we get any more dumb? And I agree. This LinkedIn's polling is a great function, but I couldn't agree more. It is blatantly being abused by so many people, almost for the purposes of clickbait. And to my mind, LinkedIn needs to do something about these erroneous polls or these polls that have got subject motivation to them. I just don't see the need. And I think it was you, Mark, who coined not long ago on LinkedIn the fact that the network could suffer greatly unless something is addressed in this regard. The feeds that people are seeing right now they're full of polls, and most of them are useless. But I do appreciate your comment about my weekly 80s poll. I don't count my weekly poll in that category. It is for fun. And the good news is that we'll be continuing the weekly 80s poll every Friday morning, Eastern time, for the coming calendar year.
That's cool. Excellent. I'm sure everyone's looking forward to that. And it's true, though, Microsoft does need to be careful because you can lose your way easily and end up in a sea of puppy and kitten videos, But on a more positive note, I did see an interesting post recently by a guy called Todd Lagerberg. I don't know him at all, but it just sort of popped up in my feed. And he was on a flight, I think it was Bentonville to Los Angeles, about 3.5 hours domestic flight in the US on American Airlines. And his 17-month-old son was screaming and crying and not enjoying the flight. But then the cabin crew came over, picked him up, and then started carrying him around and playing with him. And they spent the next 30 minutes or so playing with his young son, and then handed him back. And the kid was full of smiles for the rest of the journey. So he just posted this on as a thank you to American Airlines on LinkedIn. But then another guy, Marcus Altamirano, noticed the post and commented on it. And he's actually the people analytics leader at American Airlines. And he said, I'm going to find out who these flight attendants were and make sure they get recognized across the whole of American Airlines, as a demonstration of how to look after the customers on a plane. And I think that that's just a great example of, how you can give positive feedback, but then it's taken on board and noticed by the management of the company. So sometimes LinkedIn can really be a valuable tool.
Indeed. And well done to the team at American Airlines. And let's hope that executives across the spectrum of industries follow suit if there are good news stories that need to be highlighted about how their team members have acted in the front lines of service.
Okay, excellent. So I spoke to Lisa Stoner from Uber, And I know that you've listened to the interview as well. So I was just going to check before we go straight into the interview, what were any of the points that stood out for you?
Well, there was a few points, Mark, and I did listen to the interview. It was fascinating. I think the thing that stood out for me was the fact, Lisa brought this to life, that Uber is not just a ride sharing organization anymore. It's so much more than that. And something that really struck me was how she was talking about how they need to segment the different elements of Uber's business model, whether it's food delivery, whether it's ride share, whether it's elements around retail. And they need to be conscious about the different channels that not just the customers, but also perhaps the Uber contractors are going to use if they're going to interact with the organization. The extent to which Uber has to accommodate the multi-channel universe, I wasn't really conscious of. I mean, I had an idea, but Lisa really brought this to life. I mean, the opportunities are huge, but equally the challenges of managing all these different platforms, technologies, and the different types of agents required to manage these channels has got to be tremendous. And as you went through the discussion with Lisa, this is something I really kept my ears open for, figuring out about what Uber does to bring these best practices to the forefront, which they've clearly done, considering how the company has just grown tremendously around the world over the course of the past few years.
Yeah, and I really liked her comments around decentralization. I think that innovation is always very difficult for large international companies, but you know, she talked about how that they can test out ideas in just individual markets and see if they work out, they can roll it out globally. You know, and I can remember when Uber added helicopters as a choice of vehicle for the rides in Sao Paulo, which, you know, it seems crazy actually, but there are executives who use helicopters to get around Sao Paulo, and this is a city with more than 20 million people. So, you know, it can actually take hours to get around the place.
Yeah, and I can speak from experience, having visited you in Sao Paulo a few times. We could have used a helicopter a time or two to get from one pub to the other, but I suppose that'll be next time. Uber wasn't in existence back when I was in Sao Paulo last time.
Well, you're always welcome to come back and visit. So look, that's enough of us going on for this week. We're going to carry on with the discussion next week, hopefully with some feedback from you guys listening to this. Let's go straight to the interview now with Lisa Stoner, the Global Head of Support Operations at Uber. Okay, Lisa, it's great to have you on the CX Files podcast. Thank you very much. Now, I know that Uber manages a variety of many different types of customer. You know, you have the riders, you've got drivers, restaurants, you know, so how do you differentiate between all these different types of customer? And do you need to sort of specifically handle them very differently?
Hey, yeah, Happy New Year. So thanks for having me. So you did mention some of our customers. So there's, as you said, rider, driver, eater, but there's, you know, couriers, there's freight, there's healthcare, we've got grocery, pharmacy, a huge array of retail partners, et cetera. So it's really an ever expanding type of customers. So we differentiate them based upon some of the aforementioned lines of business, obviously region and language, some additional segmentation around usage and business customers, or think about, as an example, very new earners on the platform have different types of needs for onboarding. But we think about it as an overarching goal to have the most effective service for where people are in their multi-pronged journey with Uber. I think also an important thing to note is that different types of customers have different types of channel needs as well. So as an example, an earner who unfortunately is involved in an accident, let's say somebody is, you know, rear-ended while driving a passenger, has a very different need for an immediate type of help than somebody perhaps who has a question about their French fries being charged to them, you know, with a different price than they originally thought. So we think a lot about not just segmentation, but also immediacy of need and how we give access to people in the most effective way. So it's a really complex and fascinating infrastructure here.
That's really interesting. Yeah. And I mean, clearly the brand Uber is so well known globally now as one of the largest and most famous gig economy brands. I mean, when people talk about the gig economy, quite often it's either Uber or Airbnb. And you've got a reputation for innovation. We've seen that over the past few years. But how do you try out new ideas and launch new businesses without breaking the existing day-to-day business?
Yeah, it's funny. So Uber has turned into a verb in a lot of ways. There's both, I want to Uber somewhere, like just the verb of getting around. But I can't tell you how many things I'm invited to that have the term Uberize in them. Like, we'd like to Uberize the way we do this, or Uberize the way we do that. And it's flattering, even though I didn't, wasn't there for the beginning of Uber. It's cool to see that and work for a company like this. But people who work for Uber have a real tendency to want to lean into experimenting. So you come here because you want to move fast. You want to try new things. We're super fortunate that we don't have, we're young as a company. We don't have people who've been here for 20 years saying, gosh, we tried that 10 years ago. That'll never work. We already did that. This company didn't exist then. So the other part that makes it, I think, easy for Uber to experiment is that we're lucky in that we're decentralized and we're in many markets. So I think we've got a better ability than most, both from a cultural perspective and a market segmentation perspective, to be able to test things. And it's also okay here to test and fail. There's not a penalty for that in the same way they are for many legacy companies. So we let managers make decisions, and expect managers to make decisions really low in the organization. That's phenomenal. We lean into partners to help us experiment. I think we've got a very strong relationship with our engineering and our customer obsession. So think about it as a engineering, a technical arm of our organization. And we have experimentation teams with an incubation mandate. So it's really just an essential part of our culture and an expectation. And I'm just trying to think if I've ever even thought of someone saying, we can't try that because it'll break the day-to-day business. It's just not how we operate or think.
Yeah, and you mentioned two things there, that a decade ago, you weren't even around, and
right.
and part of your business growth is to expand into many different markets. So given that you have this kind of hyper growth, both in the size of the business and geographically at the same time, how do you manage the kind of growth there must be in customer interactions?
Yeah, it's funny. I was reflecting on this with my boss recently. So I started 4 years ago. And so Uber was pre-IPO. Uber was, I wouldn't have said a startup still, but it was definitely pre-IPO. My particular team at the time was about 19 people, and it's closer to 600 today. And so just that's a very small illustration of the kind of growth that you have to be able to support here at Uber. And we've got, with our external BPO universe, a small city's worth of people helping us in markets as different as you and I just were talking about Brazil before we started recording. We've got, Brazil and Saudi Arabia and San Francisco. It's a challenge to scale for sure. But what I would say is we're structured both by line of business and regionally. I think the teams have done a great job of having a pretty repeatable framework of what it looks like to go into a new city and launch fast. We have boots on the ground all over the world. We offer it's a pretty intimate service, right? Being in someone's car, bringing someone food. And there's just a lot of energy and focus around scaling. I think it's something that we've gotten down to a relatively exact science. And I really credit the sort of legacy people who've been here from the beginning for building that infrastructure. It's pretty amazing when you think back about it.
Yeah, and you mentioned there about the food delivery, and you have your Uber Eats service, which is, that's all over the world as well. But there's other competitors also around the world to a service like that. So it's clear that the customer experience must actually be very strategic for you to gain new customers and also to retain your existing customers. So how do you make it strategic in a kind of service like that rather than just, only adequate?
Yeah, it's stunningly competitive, right? So if I think back to the history of rideshare in particular, we were really a groundbreaking organization. There was no competition initially, and then very quickly it was everywhere. But as a company, in particular in 2022, we're focused on magical support experiences. And the foundation of those is ensuring that every interaction is rooted in and facilitates a level of trust. And as everyone knows, right, once trust is violated, it is very difficult for that trust to be regained. And in support, that's the beginning of trust. So this is where we have an opportunity to resolve customer issues. And we can either build trust or damage it. Trust is, of course, very important in safety. And I'm really proud that Uber continues to lead the industry in safety. So we think about magical customer experiences as being rooted in trust and having not just controls in place, but executing in ways that seem easy for our users. And we're continuing to invest to make lives easier for our users, no matter where they are in the ecosystem of Uber. So Uber users expect from us seamless cross-product journeys. They expect us to do what we say we're going to do, to make things simple every time, and to create high-quality magical experiences. That's a high bar. I think we're achieving it a lot of the time, but not every time. And that's our goal for 2022.
That's great.
And it's and it will, our ability to do so, in my opinion, will dictate our success as not just a support organization, but as a company.
Yeah, and that leads into a question I wanted to ask you, because quite a lot of brands seem to believe that being anywhere that the customer is, or using any channel the customer is using, that kind of creating that kind of omni-channel support is the best way to support them. And yet, if you look at some brands that are seen as leaders in their industry, then like Apple or Amazon, for example, they only serve customers on very few channels, but they do it really well on those channels. So what's your view on that kind of, few channels do it really well compared to broad omni-channel support?
Yeah, I certainly think there's wisdom in simplicity. Absolutely. And obviously, I think, any customer care executive has great admiration for Apple and Amazon. I would say here, though, that we are leaning into broader multi-channel support because it's needed based upon our customer base and based upon where in the world we operate at scale. So just to give a couple examples, in Latin America, in Brazil, again, as you know, WhatsApp is a really popular channel. People want support through WhatsApp. In many parts of the world, restaurants want that, as an example. In-app support or chat is really popular in some parts of the world. However, we have driver populations in, some countries that are not fully literate. And so they want to speak to somebody. And, obviously that makes sense. So you can't, I don't think you can force customers to use a channel that is best for you. We need to meet them where they are, particularly for us when we offer so many different types of products and services to such a wide range of a demographic population.
Yeah, and I guess that also applies because of the geography as well. I mean, like you were saying, right. In Brazil, WhatsApp, it's crazy here. I've contacted a vet to book my dog in. I've talked to a guy about putting some carpet in, and everything takes place on WhatsApp here.
Yeah. And yes, WhatsApp is popular. And so we're definitely expanding in WhatsApp, expanding in chat. We've got multiple types of obviously self-service modalities. It's funny. I know so many customer care execs are trying to go digital, right? And so how do you go digital? Well, if, in our journey, when I first started again, just 4 years ago, I would say probably 90 to 95% of the volume that I was managing at the time were in-app support. We would call them tickets. So in-app support. And now that number probably on a contact basis is, I would say, maybe 25% of our volume.
Okay, so it's still January now as we're speaking. So just to close out the interview, what are some of your CX plans or initiatives that you've got for this coming year, 2022 then?
We have a super robust roadmap. We've got some really lofty plans. So I'm excited about, we're making big investments in improving foundational tools that support our customers. So big investments in things like re-architecting our help centers, improving the discoverability and the quality of our content, improving the content systems that our agents use so they can help customers more effectively. We're deploying enterprise-wide workforce management, QA systems, sentiment analytics. We have also tremendous focus on earner support, and it's been, there's such a talent competition right now. There's such a focus on availability of people to help, not just for Uber, but in many industries. We are very committed to having seamless earner journeys, access to support. So we're really investing heavily there. And as we talked about earlier, channel expansion here too. So I'm excited to see more intelligence around the multimodality view of customers. And there's just a really robust list of things we're doing for customers. And I'm excited about how much Uber is investing in and counting on this organization to deliver. I think it's a great opportunity for my team, and I couldn't be more excited about the coming year.
Thanks for listening to the CX Files podcast. Peter and I are grateful that you're listening, and we would love to hear from you with comments on the show or recommendations for a future guest. Please contact myself, Mark Hillary, or Peter Ryan via LinkedIn. And before you go, please leave a star rating or comment for the podcast because that really helps others to find it.